Hi, I'm Dr. Philip McMillan. Thank you for joining me. I truthfully wasn't going to do anything this evening, but a presentation or a clip from GB News about the origins of COVID-19 popped in front of me. And I thought to myself, I had intended to talk about it, and so I should at least make the attempt to share some thoughts as to why I think this is important. In truth, I have been aware of this question in the scientific detail from about early 2021, but at that time you couldn't talk about it because the implications of it were so significant and it was not accepted as being something that was even possible. Now, I had to therefore lie low with that question, and it was not until about middle of 2022 that I first did a post asking some questions, and I had the opportunity to interview somebody who was central to raising that point about the origins. You have to understand that there are political implications from it. There are financial implications, but what I'm interested in is the clinical implications. Because without an understanding of where it came from, what its intended purpose was, how then can you manage disease if it presents in an unusual way? And we have to remember we're 4 years almost into the pandemic. The virus is still spreading across the world. It is doing things that we have never seen before. So I'm going to break down a few of the thoughts for you. But first, let me make you listen to the interview that occurred on GB News just today. And this was posted by Together on LinkedIn. So I've got the video clip here, and I hope the sound works this time. So I'll let you see what you think, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it.
This very one-sided, almost myopic view from the inquiry and the inquiry KC. So, again, yesterday we were told by the inquiry KC that, of course, all public health advice pointed in one direction, the need for faster and sooner restrictions. And, that is the very matter which many of us think the inquiry is there to determine.
What did you make of it when Hugo Keith pushed back when Michael said about the fact that, there is a growing body of, he didn't use the word evidence, I would, but he used the word judgment, that this is a man-made virus from the lab in Wuhan, and he was quickly told this is not within the terms of reference of this inquiry. Why, Molly?
I mean, it's incredible, isn't it? So the reason they gave was because this came out after the terms of reference were set. Well, change the terms.
Hang on, they should have been. Why weren't they in the terms of reference to start with?
Why weren't they in terms of reference? Yeah, I mean, the reason again they've given is because this is a UK inquiry. It's looking at UK matters of pandemic preparedness. But of course, you can't look at it in isolation. And in fact, our leaders are asking that we join an international alliance via the WHO. Yeah. So how can we consider this at a national level?
And if goes right that there is this view that it was started in a lab when research is being done on other viruses, we have to know about that, because if that sort of research is being done in labs here, it could be triggered here, and we might want to restrict that sort of research or regulate it better.
Absolutely, Andrew. And of course we have to know about it, because also it is likely, if it was the case, that it tempered the entire pandemic response. We need to understand what was known. Was that responsible for some of this very exaggerated messaging we saw at the beginning? Who knows? And, at least these are valid questions to be considered, and for the inquiry to say, no, sorry, out of our terms of reference is surprising.
But there's nothing in there about motive, Molly. And how do you include that in the terms of reference, I suppose, is the point. Because if this is a man-made virus in a lab, and even the FBI in America have now pretty much said that the weight of evidence is there, then who had a vested interest in finding a pandemic to get us out of this? Who had a vested interest in saying the world has to stay locked up until we can get that very profitable drug out? It all has to start with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as soon as you begin looking for motive, you are on difficult ground, legally and for this inquiry. I don't see this inquiry.
Will anybody?
This would not be the forum for that. I mean, potentially if there were ever later down the line criminal proceedings, that would be the right legal forum. I very much doubt that's going to happen here.
So this is an important point, and again, motive? What was the reason? Why was this information initially suppressed? Because that was the obvious answer at the beginning of the pandemic, and the reasons were actually quite simple. And I'll bring you back to the one of the, I guess, the first major posts that I did on Substack about this. And at that time, this was in August 2022, and I was asking, why are independent scientists ignoring the question about the origin? There are some people who believe that this is clearly naturally derived, and I'll come to that in a little bit, Garth, so I understand that perspective, but it is definitely a limited perspective, and it requires a more thorough thinking about what was happening. Because when you look at what this is the map at the time, and it's showing you the Wuhan area, and I have just highlighted here, this is the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So it's right close to the epicenter. And so if this kind of research was being done there, it would be very foolish to presume that it is impossible that that could occur. So these are very, very important points. Additionally, you have to realize that I did have the opportunity to speak with experts, and characteristically, the person who first noted a very important point about the patent that existed in the spike protein. And I'll play with you just a little introduction to that video that I did, just so that you get a flavor as to what it was that I was looking at. Had spread across the world. A scientist who was trying to understand the virus and how easily it spread was looking carefully at the spike protein on the virus. There was an unusual pattern called a furin cleavage site that made the virus much more infective. This furin cleavage site was not part of any other human coronavirus, and was certainly not a part of the original epidemic in 2003. In his search to understand exactly what it was and how it managed to be there, he stumbled on the fact that the exact sequence of this furin cleavage site was also in a patent. Yes, the exact sequence had been patented a few years before. What would you do with that information? So we have the privilege today. So that was the clip that I had. This was about a year ago when I had that interview with the scientist who did discover it. Fascinating interview. And essentially what he was doing was he was just had time in the lab at the beginning of the pandemic. He was just trying to understand this furin cleavage site that was on the spike protein, and trying to find patterns to see what other viruses could have a furin cleavage site like that. And he did what we call a blast search. And it's just a way of looking for patterns in that have already been identified and labeled. And when he did the blast search, he realized that the sequence that he found that he was looking for on the furin cleavage site was already there, and it had a patent on it. And so that was, very shocking. He sat on the information for almost 9 months because he didn't know what to do with it. He thought it was so serious. And eventually he pulled together a consortium of researchers to try and help him to analyze it. And they then published a paper on that. So this is what they call the MSH3 homology and potential recombination link to the furin cleavage site. And as I said, they did a blast search that revealed a 19 nucleotide portion of the SARS-CoV-2 genome, encompassing the furin cleavage site, which is a 100% complementary match to a codon optimized proprietary sequence that is a reverse complement of this MSH3. So this is definitely there. And what they were careful about is that they didn't say that it means that it was lab made, but they carefully said recombination in an intermediate host is an unlikely explanation. And I'll make sure I highlight that as well. This was a commentary where somebody did the challenge on it, looking at the potential recombination, and they disagree that this combination can also occur in nature. The fact that it has never occurred before is another question that could be argued. The point being is that we have a situation where there is no natural origin that has actually been clearly identified. It has been presupposed. They've spoken about the wet market where the virus actually originated from. And in truth, when you look in more detail at some of the information that was coming out at the time, and I'll highlight again another section of the presentation that I did on Substack, and this was taken from Vanity Fair, and they highlighted a few important points that actually in October 2019, there was an international competition in Wuhan. And at that time, Wuhan was already in lockdown. And they said that in a city of 15 million people, it was very strange, as they were told it was easier for the participants to get around. He got sick 12 days afterwards with fever, chills, vomiting, and insomnia. And then 60 Canadian athletes on the flight were put in isolation, and they were sick during that period of time. And so there's a real possibility that the virus was circulating from as early as October 2019. And it raises again, even more significantly, that question about origin. You'll notice in my image here, I am asking the simple question whether, if you are playing around with the virus and you're playing around with the spike protein and you're putting a furin cleavage site on it to make it more effective, what really is the purpose? And one of the questions we have to ask, and this is why I put the if the spike protein is a bioweapon, then is there an antidote? And the reason that's important is because it's relevant clinically. I use the example of, if you imagine somebody was being poisoned with arsenic, and from a clinical point of view, you weren't aware, and the person was getting sick, they were losing weight, they're having headaches all the time, and you couldn't consider the possibility that this was causing the problem, you'd never get them better. So, from a clinical point of view, we need to understand, if that was the case, not only what were the intentions, but specifically, what is it that it was designed to do? Because that's the only way that you can work something out that can reverse or be the antidote against what it is primarily targeting. One of the things that I think is very important about what is unusual about this virus is the fact that it seems to have what we call bacteriophage properties. That means it seems that the spike protein can get inside bacteria and cause them to make different toxins. I have never come across this before. I don't know if other scientists and researchers, but from a clinical point of view, that's very, very strange. And what it would be doing, if this is the case, is that it would be turning your microbiome, which is an integral part of health, into a lethal weapon. And that would be attacking you, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And that's the very serious implication. If that's the case, how do we fix that? How do we even identify that? So these are very, very important points that we have to get to the answers for. So it is clear that yes, we don't have clear evidence. But in the context of how things work in the legal system, if there is suggestion that something could be happening, there is a responsibility to investigate it and to make sure that we have uncovered as much as we can. All I can say is, for everyone who isn't interested in looking at it, you would not make good detectives or police officers, because if every time you came across somebody who was a suspect and they just said, well, I didn't do it, and you took that as fact and didn't notice that their fingerprint was on it and didn't ask questions and didn't look for for corroborations and didn't look to see whether or not there could be motive. That's not good practice. And I wouldn't expect that we would do that in this context either. My final point on this is, if somebody was intentionally doing something like this and you turn a blind eye to it and they get away with it, pretty good chance they'll do it again. And that's the lesson that I think is really, really important. There is an obligation to make sure that every stone is turned. There is too much coming out at this point that would make us ignore this. And as I said, we have 2 days left before the amendments to the WHO kick in. I was very disappointed that the WHO didn't get to the bottom of this and didn't push harder. And it makes you wonder, how will they deal with other situations like this if it was to happen again? So we have challenging times ahead. And the important point to remember is that if this is not natural, there's a pretty good chance it's not going to go away. We need to be prepared for that as well. Have a good evening.